We are about to begin, so thank you very much everybody, and welcome to Policy Exchange. We are delighted today to welcome Neil O'Brien, Shadow Minister for Education, for a speech on the future of higher education, migration and innovation. Neil, so welcome back to Policy Exchange. Neil is former Director of Policy Exchange, and we're delighted to welcome him back in his current role as Shadow Minister for Education. I would also like to say that today we have published a report, Education Not Immigration, excellent report by my colleague Zachary Marsh, who is here today. And if I will say a couple of things about this, it looks at the current case of the student visa regime. I think the public have always expressed strong support for students' migration, and much of this has been based on a premise that students come to Britain to study, they study at a university, they pay their fees, and then they depart. And as recently as 2019, this was the case. In 2019, only 3% of those who arrived on student visas transitioned onto another visa, which would allow them to stay for longer after 12 months. Last year, that number had increased to 40% of all those who arrived on student visas transitioned to another visa within 12 months of arriving. 15% of all asylum claims came from those who arrived as on student visas. That's about 40% as many asylum claims as came from those who crossed the channel on small boats. So that public perception, that vision we have of student migration, is not actually how the regime is currently working. And the second thing I would like to particularly bring out from this, and there are some hard copies available as well as it being on our website, is around cross-subsidy. So one thing which we often hear is that international students play an important role in subsidising other elements of our university system, particularly our world-class research and also domestic students. And this is absolutely a valuable thing, and we should welcome that where it happens. But what this report shows is that because of the differential fees charged by different universities, which obviously they have a complete right to do for international students, and the core cost of putting on courses, that subsidy is not evenly felt. So around 70%, 69% to be precise, is our estimate of that subsidy accrues to just over 25 universities, largely the large research-intensive universities, where it does indeed go into subsidising our world-class research base, but that the universities which are ranked below 600 in the global league tables only get 11% of that subsidy. So to the extent that the subsidy is important, it is important to some universities, it is playing much less of a role elsewhere than is often perceived. But I'll let you read the rest of the report yourself. Now Neil is here to talk more broadly than that, the future of higher education more broadly. So without further ado, Neil, please go ahead.
Thank you all very much. And it's a pleasure to be back at Policy Exchange, which has really never looked back ever since I left. And it's a bit like, I feel slightly like if Steve Jobs had invited back the guy who ran Blockbuster Video. We're in a similar situation because under Dean's leadership, Policy Exchange is producing incredible influential work, and Ian and Zachary foremost among them, with all the brilliant things that they are doing on education. So I'm genuinely honoured to be back here again. So, as everyone can tell, I've chosen the titles of this presentation entirely on the basis of what rhymes. We talk about education, migration, and innovation. What does that mean in practice? That means we're going to talk about educational, the role of the university as an educational institution, the role of students in migration, and the perennial question of how we can increase the contribution of universities to our economy. You can see that no expense has not been spared on this slide presentation, but here we have an overview of our first section. So I'm going to talk about how we got here first. So people often think there was kind of one big reform in the last 15 years, that we brought in a higher level of tuition fees. In fact, there were really 5 big reforms during that period. First, we had the growth of fees, the increase to 9,000 in 2011. Then we also had the end of number controls. So we got rid of the old controls which used to in the 1990s put fines on universities if they recruited too many students, and which managed expenditure by controlling student numbers. We then later on got rid of maintenance grants and turned it into an all-maintenance loan system in England at least, not the case in Wales. Then in 2019, the ONS decided that it would bring the student loan book onto the balance sheet for the first time. Previously, it had been a bit like PFI. We were spending lots of money, and the spending was not fully accounted for in public spending, even though we expected quite a lot of that money to be not repaid. And because the ONS brought it back on balance sheet, we then saw the 2022 reforms, in which more of the balance of the cost of student spending was put onto the graduate and away from the general taxpayer. And that has allowed those moves to higher fees, and those other reforms have allowed both expansion of our universities and a higher rate of funding growth than other public services. And it's been relatively favoured compared to other routes in education or indeed other public services. But not everything has panned out in the way that we hoped it would back in the day. I remember when I was here as director, just before the 2010 election, January 2010, we published a report called More Fees, Please, which made the case for the higher fees. And when I was still here and the government was thinking about that first big increase to fees in 2010, 2011, I remember being part of those conversations as we thrashed around through all the different ways that could work. And I remember some of what we hoped at the time. We hoped that there would be price competition. You would see a whole bunch of different price points, but that hasn't happened. And we hoped that the market would have certain qualities which I'm not sure it has had in practice. So we're going to look at what graduates are paying, and the question of could we use taxpayer resources and people's time more effectively. So just to whiz through some basic slides here, we can see on the left-hand side the ballooning of student numbers in the UK ever since the 1920s, a real explosion since 1990, continuing since 2010. And the graph on the right is showing you in real terms the total amount of money going through higher education providers, and both are simple stories to tell. The lines go up. What is the price of that? Well, the first price of it is that graduates are now paying an awful lot of money. In 2005, you could have only you'd started to repay your student loan if you were earning about 30% more than the minimum wage back then. But under the new system, the Plan 5 system, after those 2022 reforms that I mentioned, you start repaying your student loans as soon as you are earning just above the minimum wage. So that margin between the minimum wage and having to start repaying your student loans is effectively gone. And the marginal rates for young people now, and this is a question of generational fairness, are really, really high. I mean, graduates are having 51% of their income taxed away at just 50,000 of earnings. That's not a low income, but it probably doesn't feel like a lot of money in a city like this. And again, I think back to 2010, to David Willett's seminal book, The Pinch, which came out around then. We started to have the conversation about generational fairness. And yet we've created a system in which young people pay very, very high marginal rates. And because of, for example, the high income child benefit charge, the so-called HICBIC, if you get it drawn into that range of earnings, about 60,000, if you have kids, you are paying rates of tax that we used to only put onto millionaires on those kind of incomes. You're having marginal rates, as those graphs show you, in the 58 to 73% range. I mean, this is incredible marginal rates for young people who are not millionaires. And they're going to be paying back for a lot longer for two reasons. Firstly, we extended the period after which loans are written off to 40 years. That's a long time. And also people are just borrowing a lot more, so they're less likely to have repaid before that point. So if we assume that the government goes ahead with what I think is implicit in the spending review, which is that fees will rise with inflation across this parliament, then we will end up with a situation where the total amount you can borrow will go up from 59,000 to 66,000 outside London, or from 69 to 77,000 in London. £77,000. That is not a small sum of money. So graduates are paying a lot for this expansion, but it's not the case that taxpayers aren't paying either. During the period after the introduction of student loans, worsening assumptions about future earnings caused us to have to score increasing assumptions about larger and larger shares of the money that was being loaned written off. And although the government has taken steps to get graduates to repay more of the money, we're still looking at around 8 billion a year of net spending on students every year. That's a lot of money, as the government discovered last night. You know, $1 billion here, $1 billion there. Soon you're talking real money. And £8 billion a year is significant in anyone's terms. And there is a question about the balance of that spending with other routes, and that's not a new observation by me. I've given you a chunk of the Auger review from 2018 there as well, who pointed out we were spending then 8 billion to support 1.2 million undergraduates, and 2.3 billion, much less, to support 2.2 million full and part-time adult further education students. So that big disparity in funding between those two different routes, which Auger pointed to now a long time ago, is still very much there. And there's a question about whether that's the right thing. I'll whiz through this. This is just showing you spending per learner at different stages of education. The bottom line, the purple one, is the early years. Then you have primary schools, as you can see it's gone up. In the middle you have secondary schools and FE, you can see it's gone up, then a little down. And then at the top we can see higher education and this sawtooth pattern. So on the one hand, we have seen these two big increases that have then been eroded away by inflation. On the other hand, it still leaves us. I went to university in 1997, the very last year not to pay fees. And compared to then, in real terms, resources per student are still a quarter higher, even after that erosion by inflation. So you have resources are larger than when I went to university, and a lot more people go to university. So I completely understand the situation in higher education. Things are difficult. I have lots of friends who work in it. Don't underestimate the financial challenges or the decisions they're having to make, and people being let go and so on and so forth. But compared to a lot of other elements of education, the settlement for higher education, if you look at the trajectory, it has arguably been better. And there are also questions about, in an era of innovation, you know, for schools there is no real alternative for young people who can, my son 5 or my daughter 9, who can barely sit still. They do need constant attention from a teacher. There's no good alternative, despite all the technology, to having someone stand at the front of the class and teach. In higher education, we haven't really seen the innovation that we hope for, and so we have these unit costs which are still much, much higher than in any other phase of education, despite the fact that you are, in some cases, not actually having that much contact time. Not only are you not being constantly supervised by a teacher, you might not be seeing your lecturer that often. So is it all worth it? The best attempt to answer this question, I think, is one by the IFS, Institute for Fiscal Studies, done now a while back in 2020. And they look at the cost to the taxpayer, the benefit to the taxpayer, the cost to the student, and the benefit to the student. And they bring it all together, and they conclude that, seen over the whole lifetime of earnings, we estimate that total returns will be negative for around 30% of both men and women. So about 30% of students back then, it was not economically, at least, worth it for. And I'm not a Philistine. I can recognise that there might be a case for people doing things that are, quotes, not economically worth it. Some things are beautiful. There is a case for higher education spending which is analogous to arts spending or something like that, and we could have a certain amount of that. But there is a question about how much of that we want to do, given that we will be, because we are an ageing society, in a permanent fiscal vice for the rest of our lives. There's not going to be a period where there's loads of money sloshing around in the public finances. We're going to have to make difficult choices for decades and decades to come. So I enjoy the outputs of higher education, even where they're not obviously economically useful. I think Eleanor Parker, someone who many of you may follow online, wrote a beautiful book called Winters in the World about the Anglo-Saxon perceptions of the seasons. Wonderful thing. Not, inventing a new widget, but still worthwhile. But the question is, how much economically non-beneficial higher education do you want to invest in, given all the other challenges we have as a society, ranging from health to pensions to defence to you name it, and the other phases of education. 2, and that work by the FS, which found that there was about 30% of students for whom it wasn't economically worthwhile, is now quite old. Now that is looking at people using the Leo data set which we created, looking at people who graduated in the mid-noughties, and the graduate premium has been declining since then. And you can see from that bottom left chart that looks like a kind of wavy seascape that graduate and non-graduate wages increasingly overlap. Now, one of the great vices in decision making and policy making about higher education over the years has been oversimplification. And if I think about the discussions we used to have in 2010 again, people used to say, well, there's a graduate premium, let's have more higher education, bish bosh bash, discussion over. But of course, the range of outcomes for students is remarkable. And the chart on the right there, which is itself a simplification, shows you the different earnings of people by different subjects and also by their prior attainment. So totally unsurprisingly, people who go into a given subject who did better at school tend to earn more than those who didn't attain so highly at school. Completely unsurprising. And this chart, which is itself a simplification because it's bringing together a bunch of different subjects into subject categories, tells you several things. So you can see that there are certain types of subjects, particularly performing arts, media studies and the like, where no matter what your prior attainment was, your graduate earnings are likely to be very low. And we can see that there are other courses where, like engineering for example, where even those who had quite low prior attainment go on to have quite good graduate earnings afterwards. And we can see the whole fanning out of that across all these different types of subjects. Just as we did with the previous slide from the IFS, they themselves had this point about the graduate premium or the net worthwhile measure that they had being completely different across subjects. And you could repeat that blue graph across every different higher education institution as well. That was looking at the sector as a whole, and obviously the numbers are different between different institutions as well. So I don't want to oversimplify a story about graduate earnings because they are radically different by subject and institution and prior attainment. So what is the market delivering? So we got rid of number controls and we introduced a system where funding for universities is largely driven by student choice. And I would call those two things together the quasi-market. We hoped that there would be a market that would lead to people choosing good things that work for them. Is that how things have panned out? Well, the chart here shows you two things. On the left-hand side, we have this sort of strange elephant chart in purple. And that's just showing you the share of universities' income which comes from teaching grants. And that is the old way we used to fund education in universities. We used to give you a certain amount for teaching a subject, and we would give you more for teaching a high-cost subject like medicine or engineering, and we would give you less for something that was cheaper to provide. And that was also partly how we controlled expenditure on it. But that thing that gives ministers, gives policymakers control over what is taught has massively declined. It went down to about 5% even a couple of years ago. Ministers have now cut that even further. Teaching grants now called Special Purposes Grant. What's it called? Strategic Priorities Grant. It's what I think of as T grants. They've cut that by another 7%. So ministers are going to have ever less control over what is taught. We're going to rely ever more on the decisions of 16 and 17-year-olds who may not necessarily be thinking about what their graduate earnings are going to be at age 40. So I think there are limits we should recognise to the market. And this dot chart on the right-hand side here shows you the median earnings of different types of graduates by different subjects, where further to the right is higher earning, times by the number of students on in each of those subjects, which is the y-axis. And so you can see that there are some subjects on the right there, like medicine, fantastic graduate earnings, economics, maths, engineering, but they're not the biggest subjects. And we can see on the left-hand side some of those lower earning subjects where graduate earnings were less than 25,000. Some of those, particularly creative arts and design, they're really large. There's a lot of students on those courses, performing arts, sociology, media, and so on and so forth, even though the earnings are quite low. So it's certainly not the case that the quasi-market has pushed everybody into the subjects where the earnings are highest. Not that it necessarily should, but it's just quite striking to see the balance of where we're spending our money times by the earnings of graduates in different subjects. Here we try and look at the change over time, because I was just showing you the current level there in the last slide. And that turns out to be hard to do because we changed the way we collect the statistics And what I'm looking at here is UK students. And so unfortunately, we have two different systems. What can we see? I put some orange dots against things that I think are sort of interesting. In the first phase, 2014 to 2018, initial period after number controls were ended, we see mass communications sort of flatlining, creative arts and design a little bit up. And then in the second phase, since 2019 up to the most recent statistics, we see kind of, again, flatlining roughly of those kind of media and design and performing arts courses, which are large, so they're not really declining. On the other hand, we see subjects like the physics, maths, engineering and technology, which I've put a kind of grimace emoji next to, because we've seen over recent years that those subjects, which are so crucial to the government's industrial strategy and to our economic future, are declining in numbers, even though they have quite good graduate earnings. So it's not obvious from the changes that we've seen that the quasi-market is pushing us towards, or pushing young people towards the most economically beneficial subjects overall. So we'll now leave the first section where we're looking at what the quasi-market has delivered. And today is not the day where we'll specify exactly what we are going to do about all these challenges. We're still at the stage of analysis rather than policy announcements. But I want to leave you with is just a bit of a sense that the belief that we had a long time ago that a sort of quasi-market here would produce all the right outcomes and that was the only answer we needed, I think has not been borne out in reality. I think that there are issues about the way we're spending money, both for young people and for taxpayers, and too many young people are being promised a bright future if they do a particular course. You're going to be the next Johnny Ive, you're going to be a great designer, and they're ending up disappointed with quite low earnings, potentially in a non-graduate job, and having a lot of money to repay. So it's neither fair to taxpayers nor graduates at the moment. And given the pressures on the public finances, I do think that's something that we do need to look very closely at and to think about what the solution to that is, because the situation we've got at the moment is not ultimately satisfactory. Let's move on to a second massive debate about higher education, which is about overseas students. Some stylized facts to start the second bit of our discussion. Universities, as we all know, have become much more reliant on overseas fees. We'll go into why that is. The track data, the transparent approach to costings data, suggests that there is a growing surplus from overseas students, which offsets losses elsewhere, particularly on research. Levels of exposure to overseas students vary massively between different institutions. Again, there is no such thing as a typical university or a typical student. There's massive variation. And the mix of who is coming as overseas student has also hugely changed over recent years under the new immigration system since 2021. And broadly speaking, what's happened is that the shift has been from towards many more coming from relatively poorer countries, which have higher staying on rates where people are much less likely to leave. And as well as shifting towards those countries with higher staying on rates, the staying on rate itself has very much increased. So you have two things that are multiplying each other to lead to the student route becoming a large source of net immigration over recent years. So, again, to look at some data here, let's tell the simple story. Why have universities become more reliant on overseas fees? It's no mystery. The top left shows you the growing share of their income that comes from fees. It's partly about what's happened to domestic tuition fees and the freezing of them over time. It's partly that we have just a lot more overseas students, and you can see that that growth is really concentrated among taught masters. That's the fourth chart in the middle section at the bottom there, the one that's growing really, really, really fast. And we can also see that research income, their other big source of income, has grown more slowly than their income from overseas fees. And you put that all together, you have universities becoming more reliant on overseas fees. Oops, just being on. This just then delves a little bit more into this delves a little bit more into, if we go, here we go. There's a manual element to this, to the slides here as well. If we go, are we back one or? Sorry, here we go. There we go. Okay. We have here just a simple chart showing what makes a profit and what makes a loss for universities, if we can put it in slightly blunt terms. And you can see that the top line, that dashed orange line, is the profit being made from overseas student, and the bottom dotted line is the loss that they're making on research. And the situation is not actually very different between England and Northern Ireland and Scotland and Wales, even though it's a different system. You still have the basic story of rising profits on international students and rising deficits on research on the other hand. At the moment, it's quite hard to find good data about how that profit is distributed, because the OFS doesn't publish that in any detail. We can see that the profit is bigger for Russell Group type of institutions, so they are able to make a larger profit margin on overseas students, about 66% for the Russell Group, roughly speaking, compared to 30% overall. And thanks to the excellent report we have out, I'm now the first user of your report. We have a chart on the right-hand side here, doing the same thing but ranking by world university rankings, and you can see the same thing. The profit from overseas student is particularly skewed towards what you might call the more research-intensive universities. And the growth also has been very unevenly spread as well. The strongest growth in overseas students has been in non-Russell Group taught postgraduate courses. So a classic one-year master's in a non-Russell Group institution would be the typical big growth area. And that within that concentration, there is further concentration in particular subjects, and the sort of empire state building, like really sharp takeoff, you can see in the right-hand side chart there, is in business studies, and that has been the absolutely most typical subject in which overseas student numbers have grown most rapidly. So who is most exposed to, most dependent on overseas fees? We can see that, broadly speaking, overseas fees account for about a fifth to a quarter of income for the top 100 universities. And that bottom right chart there shows you the top 100 universities. The orange bit is how much of their income comes from overseas fees. There are some universities that it's bigger than others. So for Manchester, it's about 33%, Glasgow, Leeds, Durham, very similar. But then once you get outside the top 50 most research-intensive universities, they are more dependent on domestic fees, partly because they have a lower research income. And the bottom left chart there just shows you ranked by the percentage of their income that comes from overseas fees, all of the institutions that we've got. And so there's about 34 institutions, lots of which you've heard of, where more than 40% of their income comes from overseas fees, Buckinghamshire, Roehampton, so forth and so on. So there's a big range of exposure to overseas fees, and we know a bit about it, but there is more to be known. Why are we even having this discussion? Ian said at the start, you know, students come and then they go, and everyone's a winner, everyone's happy. Well, this is what happened over the last 4 years, and this is just looking at students, nothing else. So the gross number of people who came to study was just over 1 million, 1.1 million, and the net number after you take out people leaving was over 750,000. If you add in their dependents as well, that meant that student migration added 1 million people to the population in 4 years. So that is, if you think about a city of 1 million people, or, you know, it's basically roughly 3 cities the size of Leicester in 4 years, just from the student route. Right? That's a lot of people. You don't have to be in any way a migration skeptic to think that is a large number. That is one of the reasons why we're having this discussion. And you might say, well, hang on a minute, this is a slightly funny concept. People about 10 years ago got hung up on the idea of, should we take students out of the numbers? But of course, students take themselves out of the number. If they come and they study and then they leave, then they are a zero net migrant. They have left. So they take themselves out of the number. And student migration is a slippery term and a slippery concept, because what happens is that people come as students, but they don't necessarily stay as students. They change onto a different route. So with all those caveats in mind, I thought we'd just look at what has happened to student migration. And we can see that changes to policy have a much bigger impact on the numbers coming from poorer countries than they do from developed countries. So on the left-hand side, you have the EU and North America, Japan, Israel, Korea, and so on, basically developed countries. And the policy changes don't make a heck of a lot of difference. They basically stay the same over time. But you can see on the right-hand side here, where we look at some developing countries, you can see a bulge on the left, which is the turning on and then off again of the post-study work visa, which we got rid of during the coalition years. And then on the right-hand side, you can see the same bulge but bigger when Boris Johnson turned post-study work visa back on again against the advice of the Migration Advisory Committee. The odd person out, in a sense, or the odd country out on the right-hand chart is China, which is a massive part of the UK student body, which kind of follows its own logic. It doesn't follow the same pattern as countries like India, Pakistan, Nigeria, Bangladesh, and so on. It's tended to rise over time and then has sort of abated a bit in the last couple of years, but it's still a huge part of our overseas student body. So we can see that the mix has really changed, and the policy makes a difference. And although I've mentioned so far the post-study work visa, that's only really one policy change. And in migration, every official in the Home Office I've ever talked to about this, everyone who's ever worked on it, always tells me it's kind of like a waterbed. Everything is connected to everything else in migration, and if you turn up one route or turn it down, it tends to affect others. And so I think it is fair to say that policy changes that you wouldn't think of as being about student migration, like the social care visa, now abolished, or about to be abolished, they also affect student numbers, because if it's easier to stay on and work in the UK, that attracts more people, and not just through student routes. So the policy environment is more complicated than just the post-study work visa, but we can see from this chart that the post-study work visa had a massive impact. Both the turning on and off of it are incredibly clear in the numbers of students coming from developing countries. So let's go back to that net and gross discussion. As Ian said at the start, in terms of main applicants, the people actually coming to study, we were quite close to net zero student migration as recently as 2019. So what we've seen more recently is historically not that normal. And if we look at study dependents, people coming as dependents, adult dependents or child dependents of people who are coming to study, we see a real bulge in about 2023, and then we can see that the Sunak government's reforms have made a big impact there, and the number of study dependents who are coming is now close to net zero again. But we're still seeing a net flow of people coming as main applicants. And in the bottom left, the blue bars there, the dark blue and the light blue bars, is some numbers about the point that I made at the start, which is not only has the mix of students moved towards people from poorer countries, but the proportion of those people who then stay on has massively increased. And that's the difference between the dark blue bar and the light blue bar for a bunch of countries. So for some countries, within 3 years, you have 75% moving on to a different visa. And I remember certainly in the year to, I think, June 23, 15% of those who came as students had moved on to a non-work visa, a family or a humanitarian visa, within 1 year of coming. And about half of those who came had moved on to a non-study visa within 1 year. And you can see that goes up over time. So there's been a big change, not just in the number of people who are coming, but also into the probability that those people will stay on. And that is why you had that 1 million net student migration number that I quoted at the start of this section. And then at the kind of the bottom end of what you might call the higher education market, there have been some quite serious problems, which have been incredibly well publicised. Here is a bunch of headlines. Some of these institutions are not in Universities UK, they are for-profit small institutions. They've been through phases of these debates where we had a big crackdown on visa mills in the early coalition years. And I think there are practices going on at the moment which I think everyone, including the DfE in fairness to them, would regard as abusive, where people have very low English language levels, are coming, not really doing much in the way of studying. And their primary motivation is really to come to the UK and stay here rather than to study. But there's a mix of motives for lots of students, right? So if everyone was purely motivated by study, then the graph that I showed you of developed countries versus poorer countries would be the same, right? If everyone was just motivated by study, the option of the post-study work visa and other things like the social care visa wouldn't be making any difference to student numbers. But we can see that they do make a difference. And I'm not criticizing people for that. That's the option that we have developed for them in terms of policy. But we should be clear that study is not the only motivation of those who come to study, because if you're coming from a relatively poor country, not only can you work while you are here as a student, and a lot of people do that in my constituency, but you can then at the moment also move on and work in any job at any earnings level. That is what the post-study work visa does for you, and the government are not getting rid of that. They've reformed it so you can do it for 18 rather than 24 months, but that is a trivial change that I don't think anybody expects to make any difference to the overall numbers. So that's international student migration. And the third thing I promised to talk about was universities as economic institutions. I'll be a bit briefer on this point. I think the overall story is not a bad one, but the question is always, can we do better? And there have been multiple attempts over the last 40 or 50 years to try and get more economic bang for our buck out of universities as sort of research institutions and economic institutions, starting with what used to be called the research selectivity exercise in the early 80s, which is now called the REF. And more recently, we've been trying to emphasize impact, social impact and economic impact within those funding streams. And we have different things. We have the REF, which is the research excellence, which is a lot of money. We have the teaching excellence framework, which matters in terms of your ability to persuade people to come study with you. And then we have the poor relation, the knowledge exchange framework, which is about what you do with businesses and the community. And that is much, much smaller, as we will see. And the overall story here is that attempts to kind of push universities towards having more economic impact have not had that much effect. This is not to say that they're not having a beneficial impact, it's just that policy attempts to get more out of taxpayer spending have not been particularly successful, I think, in recent years. So on this slide, I give you a long quote from Mrs. Thatcher in 1983, just to show you that none of these debates are new. There she is in 1983, complaining that they've given the research councils protected funding, but they're doing useless things that aren't any good for the economy. So none of these debates are new. And though the text is too small for you to really read, those two right-hand charts from the OECD basically show you that the UK institutions are doing quite a lot of interaction with businesses compared to comparatives in other countries. So as I say, this is not a bad story, though just one caveat to that is that the UK spends a much larger share of its research budget through higher education rather than, say, government labs or third-party institutions like Fraunhofer in Germany or the US government departments. And so we've made a choice to put a lot of our research money through universities. So we do hope that they will be pretty good on measures like this. If you flick on here, I just want to show you that the direct funding for economic impact is really niche within research funding, never mind university funding overall. So the chart on the right is showing you how much research funding, QR funding, excellence-related funding each university gets from the government, and showing you them ranked. So you have Oxford and Cambridge on the far left there, getting a lot of money, down to the long tail of institutions not getting very much. And then a little orange smear at the bottom is HIFE, which is funding explicitly to do more with businesses and the local community. But that is pretty evenly distributed, and it's capped at 5 million quid, I think, still. So for Oxford, that is 0.15% of their total income. It's not a big part of how government funds them. And so we don't really directly incentivize universities to do more, broadly speaking, economic stuff, you might say. Do we do that through the other mainstream sources of funding, the bigger ones? So about 2 billion going through the Research Excellence Framework, the REF, and policymakers, including me when I was at Downing Street in 2016, wanted to get the REF to be more driven by impact, not just an academic concept of excellence. And so we put in 25% that would be based on impact. But now another 25% has been added for people, culture, and environment, which is really driven by a kind of EDI type of motive, and universities are going to be scored on things like the percentage of their staff from ethnic minorities and so on. And that is more broadly the trend in funding bodies across the piece. I wouldn't say, and I don't see any evidence that there has been a big shift towards more economically driven funding. I do see a big shift towards more EDI driven funding. So for example, now the NIHR, the other big funder for health research, they will only fund work if it can show it will reduce inequalities. You might have a great idea for a drug, it might benefit a lot of people, but if it's not going to reduce inequalities, you will not be funded. Royal Society has fellowships that are only open to some ethnic groups. Wellcome have a bunch of, so on and so forth. There's been a shift towards more EDI, but not really, I would say, a single-minded focus on growth from our research funding bodies. A headline there from the Times with a bunch of academics in favour of academic freedom complaining about this and concerned that they are going to be judged on things that are nothing to do with the quality of their research, never mind the economic impact. And the other thing to say about universities, economic institutions, is that a bit of it that you think of as the core of what universities in the public imagination might be doing for the economy, which is kind of research students. Research postgraduates have grown much more slowly than other bits of the student body. So total number of UK postgrads is up 11%, science postgrads up a little bit more, 15%, but that's within a context where total student numbers are up 28%. And so the relative growth of those kind of research postgrads, which are the people that policy makers always have in their minds when they think about universities. They think of the young, brilliant person making some breakthrough in a university lab that will turn into a great product. The growth of that is much slower than the rest of the system, and that's another thing for us to think about. And all these questions, they shade off into wider debates, which is the note that I'm gonna end on. You can't see universities as economic institutions in isolation from wider policy. I do think that we have had success in getting better at startups, and particularly in university spin-outs, getting nearly 10% of all UK equity funding now. We're not so good at scale-ups in the UK. There are long-running debates about what we could do about that, endless discussions about the various incentive schemes that we've got, like VCT, SEED, EIS, and so on. Organisations that we've created like the British Business Bank and so on. One of the things I worked on quite a lot when I was in number 10 was on trying to improve commercialisation and tech transfer. We have seen universities come together more to collaborate and get to scale in some of these things. Northern Grit Zones, Set Squared and so on, equivalent in the Midlands. There's lots to think about the incentives for academics, about the university's policies on IP and so on, and indeed physical constraints. You can't grow lab space in Cambridge because there's not enough water and things like that, things that we absolutely must address. I was very surprised the first time I ever went to Cambridge Science Park, which is very much in Cambridge, to discover that it is technically not in Cambridge, actually in South Cambridgeshire. And so the planning issues around all of these things are a big deal. But anyway, I'm not going to get into those wider debates. I've probably hit you with far too many slides already, and it's time to move to the public discussion. But to summarise, I think there are massive questions about the way the quasi market is working, and about the future of our universities as educational institutions. I don't think that all is for the best in the best of all possible worlds, and that the market is unimprovable. I do think that given we're spending £8 billion and that young people are really struggling to get on in life because they are paying an awful lot back, we do need to ask about the mix of what is being produced and whether it is the right thing. I think there are inevitable questions about student migration and the role that that plays in our wider migration picks. Overwhelming majority of the public in polls, and the numbers have gone up, say that they want to dramatically reduce migration, and student migration has to be part of delivering on that for the public. And I think there are bigger questions about the role of the university as an economic institution, where I don't think we're doing badly, and I think there are wonderful things that happen every day in our universities. But again, given the money we are spending, I think we could still do better, and we could rise to meet the best in the world and to have some of the magic that happens in Boston, in Silicon Valley, and in the great kind of hubs in around the Chinese universities as well. So there's a lot to think about. I'm not going to pretend to have every answer here today. The reason that I'm here is partly to get your question and to open a dialogue with all of you. There are very, very expert people in the audience today, so that we can draw on your expertise to try to start to answer these questions sensibly. But on that note, I will stop, and it's over to you. Thank you very much.
Well, thank you very much for that, Neil. I think it shows that you can take the director out of the think tank, but you can't take the think tank out of the director. So, real tour de force of presentation. I'll open it up to questions, but before that, I just wanted to ask you one myself. So, I'd like to go back to what you said very early on about sort of the intergenerational compact. And you've written a sort of very widely read essay recently, which you call The Confluence. And it seems there is a bit of a confluence happening here with young people in that they have very high marginal tax rates, they have a very difficult property market, whether they're renting or buying, and then they have sort of £50,000 plus of debt from their studies, many of them. I know you're not yet in policies, but in principles. If you're looking at the deal that we offer to young people around a university degree, what are the sort of principles in your mind that you think where the country needs to get better on that deal?
In one sense, that has a simple answer, which is, I just think at the moment we are encouraging people to rack up a lot of debt, which we then make them repay at quite low earnings. And I would feel less bad about that if the product that they were getting was in all cases having the miraculous impact on their earnings that people sometimes want to imply that it will, but the truth is that it isn't. And so people are feeling let down, they're feeling like they are paying a lot of tax, they can't get on in life, they can't buy a house, they can't start a family. A tragic situation in lots of ways, which has massive long-term implications for us as a society unless we can fix it. And sure, there's loads of different parts to that puzzle. The housing part of it is a big part of it. But clearly, given that so many young people do now go to university, sorting out what's happening with higher education and the very high rates of tax paid by young graduates has got to be part of the answer to the question about generational fairness. It just has to be.
Fantastic. Thank you very much. I'll take a few questions from the audience. I'll take a number at once. Madeline, and then Henry.
Thanks, Madeline Assumption, Director of the Migration Observatory. I am interested in your view on the debate about whether policy towards international students should be different across different types of institutions, obviously particularly the sort of more versus less selective ones, and to what extent your view on that question is driven by students staying, the likelihood that students will stay on in the UK, that particular issue around people staying long term versus all of the other factors, impacts of international students.
Yeah,
thank you. I'll just take a couple if that's okay. Henry.
Thank you. If you step back from tuition fees and consider what they are functionally the state propping up a sector by using taxpayer credit and Klarna's buy now, pay later payment model to sell teenagers unconditional mortgages that will follow them through bankruptcy. Is that just on basic principles an ethical way to prop up any public service? And if it is, what other parts of the government could we finance that way?
Yeah. Let's do it in reverse order. Brilliant question, punctually put. As you can tell from my presentation, no, I think we are really letting young people down here. We're telling them one thing about what's going to happen to them as a result of going to university, and it's not true. And we are walking them at an incredibly young age into a set of really consequential choices for their financial future. In many ways, there's evidence that some of those choices are bad. Even from 5 years ago, the evidence was there was 30% of people for whom it wasn't worth it, and we don't know, but there's a decent chance that proportion will have gone up since. So no, I think it's terrible, really, and has to be fixed. Are there other parts of government like it? Well, PFI is the closest comparator, where you had all these things off the off of the books, and that caused huge expansion until some of those things got reclassified, and then our behaviour changed. I think it's striking that the behaviour and the attitudes of the Treasury to this stuff did change when it came on balance sheet. But I think our attitudes are still need to change further if you get my drift. So no, I think it's a big problem, and I think young people are rightly very cheesed off about it. To Madeline's question, so this is one brilliant think tank nested in question to another brilliant think tank. You can play endless tunes in terms of what your policy could be on how you approach the question of student migration, which is really a subset of the wider migration debate, because as I say, people come as students, but they don't necessarily stay as students. They move on to a work visa, family visa, some claim asylum, some just disappear because the numbers are so bad. And as you know better than anybody else, our data we have on the earnings of some of those people and their dependents leaves a lot to be desired, so it's difficult to make sensible observations or choices about some of these things. But yeah, you can see the whole spirit of my set of slides is there is no such thing as typical higher education. There's massive differentiation. There's differentiation of how much people earn. There's huge differentiation about how likely you are to stay on based on where you come from, what you're studying, where you're studying it, and so forth. There's a lot of different filters and lenses you can look at these things through, and then you have the question which we would struggle to answer at the moment of what happens to those people afterwards. Do they become net contributors? Are they net recipients? Where do they end up? And so on and so forth. And you've done brilliant work exposing some of these data gaps, which make it more difficult for us to have a sensible discussion. I mean, I hope that the MAC have done a bit on the skilled worker route. They've promised to do similar exercises for other routes like the family route and the student route and so on. I say, roll on that work. Let's get it done so we can have a more sensible answer. But yeah, so that's one way of looking at it. But there are plenty of ways you could cut it.
If I would just add on that one, Madeline, I think
here's one you made earlier.
Yes, indeed. So I think in our report, one of the things we recommended is that the levy being proposed by the government should be exempted from some of the most research-intensive universities. They should be exempt on the grounds that the students are playing a key role in cross-subsidising something which as a country we very much value, which is that research. Whereas elsewhere, where there's less evidence of that subsidy, a levy makes sense to ensure that the benefits of migration are felt more broadly. And Zachary has done some very interesting things. There's all sorts of metrics you can use on how you class universities. We've got a little lovely sort of Venn diagram here. But one thing which is interesting is that on the 3 different metrics, you've got this core cluster of 25 universities, which on any of the 3 would be in your cluster of top universities. Of course, you can class this down, but there are certain universities where it could make sense, and one could rationally, without using a sort of a self-selective measure such as the Russell Group, draw those lines, whether it was around the levy, whether it was around the graduate ute, if a government was minded to do so. I think we've got time for one more round of questions. So Sunda, and then Amanda, and then the gentleman just there.
Thanks, Sunda Katwala, British Future. So, Neil, what I heard, I think, is that nobody really owns this quasi-market, and you feel that the taxpayers paying a lot, the graduates are paying a lot, and you want less international students certainly at the bottom half. So, does that mean that you're saying that governments and oppositions should say that over 2 parliaments we will have a smaller sector and we should manage that, or do you think there are other ways that could be avoided?
Thank you. Again, we'll take the 3. So Amanda.
In this room yesterday, I commented on the reluctance to allow one strand of education to be given priority over another in the context of pre-18 education. We have this permissive approach where we're extraordinarily reluctant to constrain individual and actually institutional choice. So we've still, in higher education, as far as I can see, got a model where, except in a handful of subjects where it really is completely impossible, like medicine, a bizarre sort of policy neutrality that doesn't acknowledge that both for the individual and for the institution and for the country as a whole, there is a very unequal benefit from students in different courses. Why do you think it is so hard? I mean, I can see in the EBAC pre-16 and the resistance to the EBAC how deeply embedded that is. Do you think it's as big a problem in higher education, or do you think it could be tackled?
There's a gentleman just here, I believe. The one just in front with their glasses.
Thank you. Do you think the 25% weighting that's given to people, culture and environment in the ref, that's all the EDI stuff, should be reduced or even thrown out altogether? It sounded like you aren't a fan. And do you think some universities should maybe stop doing research altogether in order to give certain other universities a bigger share of the research funding pie?
Okay, I'll try to work backwards in order. I think I can't answer the last question there sensibly. I mean, you can see that the research funding is incredibly unevenly distributed at the moment. It's very concentrated on a few institutions around the Golden Triangle, and there's lots of policy considerations there about who gets what. One would be a geographical one. I mean, I've written previous things thinking about how you can get more benefit from public research outside the Greater South East, and indeed the last government set a target in law to increase the share of our public research funding that went outside the Greater South East. So the last one I can't answer. On your second last question, I think as you say, I did answer it. I'm just very sceptical about this new element which is being added that's not been there before, which is not really about the research at all. It's about a bunch of social objectives that are being brought in from outside, and even within that, the way they're being cashed out seems to be extraordinarily crude and divisive. So I'm pretty sceptical about that as a direction of travel, as you can tell. To Amanda's excellent question, absolutely. I mean, your experiences as an inspector of schools, the contrast with universities must be extraordinary. And of course, one thing that I didn't mention so far is that the Treasury lives in constant fear that universities will be reclassified to the public sector and all their debt and borrowing will come on balance sheets if it interferes too much. And that Treasury motive combines with a general power difference between universities and schools versus, universities and government versus schools and government, where the universities are a more powerful and more influential sector, and the approach is much more hands-off. You talked about policy neutrality, but although the quasi-market sort of purports in some ways to be neutral, of course it's not, and we recognise that by having those residual teaching grants, without which a lot of those important subjects would completely collapse. One thing that has gone right is that we have funded more medical school places. We're further increasing that through the NHS long-term workforce plan, which I worked on. But in other areas, the story is not so pretty. I mean, we've had 4 chemistry departments, I think, shut recently. Another 2 are threatened. And so by not funding those higher cost subjects for their higher costs, it's not a neutral decision. You will tend to get less of those things, which we can see the earnings from which and the strategic industrial importance of which are really high. And to Sun's question about what do you then do about all these things, we're not today in the business of providing definitive answers, but the question, I suppose, is what do you think should happen to the people who are currently going to low value HE and ending up with very low graduate earnings and a lot of debt? Okay, because essentially there's lots of different possibilities. They could be in a better version of HE and has better returns for them. They could be doing something else. Perhaps they could be an apprentice, a higher apprentice, in which case they would be in university part of the time and in work some of the rest of the time. They could be doing something completely different. FE could be better funded, as Olga suggested, or they could be in work. So there's lots of different places they could potentially be that would be potentially more beneficial. I mean, there's a statistic that has been around for a long time that I think it's the average level 4 apprentice earns more than the median graduate 5 years after graduation. So the returns on some of these higher apprenticeships are really good, and yet the government has just done a 90% cut in the top apprenticeships, the level 7 ones. So I think that's a mistake. But I can't answer your question directly today, but I think there are good reasons to think they could be doing something better with their time that would be not just better for the taxpayer, but better for them in the longer term. And you can say, well, some of these things, well, they're beautiful. You're a terrible Philistine for saying it's all about the economy. And that's not what I'm saying. I do recognise there is a case for what you call kind of arts council funding. But that is not the basis on which we are selling these large piles of debt that Henry mentioned to these young people. We're telling them it's going to be good for them financially, and that turns out to be not true, and that is what we call mis-selling, and that is a problem.
Fantastic, Neil. Thank you very much. Thank you for coming here today. We've had a fantastic presentation, some great questions, and if we could just show our appreciation to Neil in the